Indeed, we need to reinvent our education system, and there is a need of change, and it is clear for everyone. But education is one of the very important building blocks and pillars, along with others. Let's say that they're very clearly described in the SDGs by UN, but coming up next is a very special open discussion on the importance of other very, very, very clearly stated and needed equality, diversity, and inclusion for the sake of strengthening our society. This is a special model which we have invented during this Global Webit Special Impact Week, where we invite thought leaders without a moderator to challenge the topic and to self-produce what really matters to be said and to be heard from our beautiful Webit community from all around the world. That's why I will just introduce our upcoming guests and they will do the rest for you. I have the true pleasure to welcome Aubrey Blanche, Global Head of Equitable Design and Impact Founder, Culture Act, the Mathpath, Danielle, DeRuiter-Williams, and Professor Phakeng, Vice-Chancellor, University of Cape Town. The floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Mamokgethi Phakeng. I'm Professor of Mathematics Education here at the University of Cape Town. I'm also Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Cape Town since the 1st of July 2018. I've been a professor for over 20 years, and I'm also an illustrious visiting professor at the University of Bristol in the UK. Over to you, Aubrey.
All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Aubrey Blanche. I'm the Senior Director of Equitable Design for Product and People at CultureAmp and the CEO of the Mathpath. But my work focuses on creating equity in organizational processes as well as technical products. But I'm so excited to be here with Danielle today. So I will let you introduce yourself.
Hi, really excited to be here. My name is Danielle DeRuiter-Williams. I am wrapping up my time as Head of Growth and Expansion at the Justice Collective. I'm excited to kick off the new year as one of the co-founders of Venture with Purpose. And I come to this work with a lot of both lived and learned experience. Growing up in Western Michigan as a biracial woman and navigating my identity, the work I do really looks to connect our lived experiences with organizational change and transformation through both policy practices and also shifting paradigms. So I'm really excited to be here.
Yep. So the topic of our discussion today is strengthening society by improving equality, diversity, and inclusion. And for me, being a president of the top university on the African continent in a country that suffered apartheid for more than 40 years, a transformation, inclusivity, diversity, and equity are very important to my work. In fact, they are key. And so when I saw this topic, I thought, the first question would be, why do we need diversity? Why do we need inclusion? And I'm saying, why do we need diversity and inclusion? Because as important as diversity is, diversity will mean nothing without inclusion, in my view. But here's the reason why we need diversity and inclusion. I mean, we need them because what we have today, the kind of world that we have today, is what it is because we didn't pay attention to diversity and inclusion. The world has been directed or dominated by a few people in the world. And it doesn't matter which country, but it's been mainly white, male, and Western. And that has brought us to where we are now. In fact, If that domination was useful, we wouldn't have all these ills that we have, whether it's climate change, whether it's gender-based violence, whether it's poverty and inequality. It's because of leadership that we've had. It's because we've only benefited for a minority of people in the world. So we need to, that's why it's important, diversity and inclusion are important today. If we don't open up to diversity and inclusion, we will bring the world into even more deeper problems, and none of us will survive. So for me, that's why we need diversity and inclusion. And I know that even the success of my university is not guaranteed without diversity and inclusion. And that's why transformation is one of the key pillars of my vision, together with excellence and sustainability. Without diversity and inclusion, as well as excellence, we will never have sustainability or a sustainable success for the institution. Aubrey, how did you come to this topic that they gave us for today?
Yeah, so I came to the topic a little bit by accident. So I always tell people I went into tech as, you know, a queer, disabled Latino woman and couldn't find anybody who was like me. And I say that as a white passing woman. I was alienated. So I can only imagine, you know, for other members of our community, how much more exclusive and uncomfortable that would feel. And that kind of insight was what drove me to become obsessed with this problem. Because I was like, well, if I'm experiencing exclusion, how much more extreme would it be for other people? And I felt very lucky to have had the training and education to have grown a skill set that was useful in some way. And so for me, it was like, well, if I have all this privilege, I might as well use it for something for good, as opposed to just, you know, walking around in the world. So that was it for me. Is I've always been a social scientist. And so this seemed like a problem that those skills could be really useful for. And for me, it was very much just about, we should all do something. And I was lucky enough to have a work environment where when I put my hand up and said, there's a problem and I want to solve it, I got a yes. And so that began the 10-year journey. But Danielle, what about you? How did you get into this work and what drives you?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As I kind of alluded to in my intro, a lot of it was recognizing from an early age how complex our society was, how the experiences that my dad, who's Black, was having and what he was experiencing was very different than my mother, who's white, and myself kind of navigating, again, that complexity and trying to find my way. And so going into college and being in a predominantly white institution, grappling with, you know, being the only one in the room, and then having that experience continue after my education, right? Where not only am I the one who's experiencing certain things, but also bringing up the structural inequities in classes. I remember very specific example of being in, I got a degree in planning, in urban planning, and being in class and talking about like why people weren't developing a certain neighborhood in Los Angeles. And I'm the only one who's like structural racism, like historic and present structural racism. And having the professor be like, well, yeah, but I mean the land cost. And I'm like, but structural racism though, right? And so, you know, having that experience of being a singular individual inside of organizations, inside of institutions, and recognizing that that was not only affecting me as a person, but it also impedes the ability of organizations to be really effective in the world, right? We talk about diversity and inclusion as if people of color are not the global majority, right? Our power structures don't even reflect the population, quite frankly, as you know, Professor Hetty was discussing earlier. And so that lived experience and wanting to do something about and change not only folks inside of organizations, but also make organizations more effective in achieving their missions. I think equity and inclusion is just a superior strategy for what anything that you're trying to tackle and anything you're trying to do. And so I'm curious to know, you know, we talk a lot about equity and inclusion as it relates to, you know, racism and our long kind of storied history around that. gender plays into that as well. And so Aubrey, is there, in your experience at Culture Amp or prior to that, how does kind of gender inequity play out as well?
Oh, that's such a good question. So,
Yeah.
so sorry, I jumped in.
Go ahead.
What I was going to say something a little bit left field, which is that I think that when I think about sort of working on DEI, I often tackle racism and disability access first, because I think a lot of the changes that you make to support creating an organization that is not infested with anti-Blackness or racism also end up producing gender equitable outcomes. And so I think that there isn't necessarily the reverse, where if you focus on gender equity, you don't get racial equity. But I think that you get a lot of gender equity gains by focusing on racial equity, because it turns out there are gender minorities who are people of color. So I think that's, for me, how I think about gender equity. And the strategy that we've approached at Culture Amp is we've very explicitly focused on anti-racism for the last year and a half, and are beginning to focus on critical disability and access. And what we're seeing is that at almost every level of the company, we've achieved gender equity, not only in terms of representation, but also in terms of experience, right? So this speaks back to Khethi's really good point about diversity and inclusion, not just diversity. But Khethi, I'll throw it to you, because I'm sure you have a wealth of knowledge on this.
Well, I mean, it's interesting what you're saying, Aubrey. What to focus on first and what to get as well, just by focusing on gender equality and racial equality. I mean, my approach. I mean, and it's very easy for me, being a minority in every which way. It doesn't matter where I am in the world. That even if I walked into the supermarket in South Africa or anywhere in the world with any of you, you would get more attention than I would. And the assumption would be that you are more educated than I am, and you earn more money than I am, and you deserve more attention than I do. Okay, so one, it's a minority in that way. But if you think about it, all those decisions would be made just on the basis of what I look like. All right, but the truth of the matter is that I'm not just a small Black African woman. I'm so many other things. And so I talk a lot more about intersectionality than just focusing on one kind of diversity, because I think and in my, for example, leadership team, I always say I need a diverse team, and it is a weakness if we are all heterosexuals. There is something that we will not see. It is a weakness if we are all Christian. There will be something, we might find that actually we don't understand Hindu students. We don't understand why Muslim students do not want to write exams on Eid. So there's something, for me, there's maybe there's levels that achieving gender equality and racial equality doesn't tell me much, because actually I think class inequalities are much more important. Having grown up poor, I know how important it is. And you can see the Black African students can fly much more than anyone else, because they grew up in wealth. They've got access to many other things. And so I like to see all of that. So as much as when I look at my transformation agenda, I look at the race, I look at the gender, I look at, more important, I look at first at university, first in family to go to university. That looks different. And of course, in my university, it is not mandatory for students to declare their race or to declare their gender. They do it voluntarily. And that's because the racial categorizations that we have come from apartheid. And those racial categorizations in apartheid were not innocent. So people like me were at the bottom, and then you had colored, you had Indian, you had white, and per capita expenditure was different. It went up as you go up the ladder. And so there is a political stance that rejects the racial categorizations, because using them means that you still giving value to what apartheid has created. So every time I use them, I make clear that I'm using apartheid categorization just in case they offend anyone and the reasons why I need to use them. Okay, so as much as we want to change that, it's a recognition that the ideal place that we want to be at is one that's non-racial. But to get there, of course, we need to see who's who in the zoo. And of course, so students have a right to decide whether they, and staff, whether they want to declare their race or not. And it's always interesting because at first year, we don't use race. We don't say to students to declare, but we ask them what their parents, for example, what their mother was categorized as during apartheid. What we ask particular questions so that we can figure out what they are until they decide whether they want to declare or not. And some of them decide to declare, some of them don't. And we can go back and look at what the data that they gave us, and so how do we place them and what has happened from there. It's just interesting. But for gender, we open to non-binary genders, for gender diverse, trans and gender diverse individuals. And so we don't want to lock people into one group, and we don't want to call people other. So people, they can leave it blank. So that kind of openness also, is a sign, is something that says we value diversity, but we also value the fact that you declare what you want to declare as an individual. Does it create complexity in terms of seeing what progress we're making in terms of diversity and inclusion? It does. But it also is very interesting to see the number of people who declare and the campaigns that go around for people who encourage staff and students to declare. So we trying to work, and it is not something that's common across universities in South Africa. It's in our university, it's a political stance because we're working towards inclusivity, means that we envisage a time where race will not be used to categorize you, where gender is not something that we use to put you in this box or the other. Complex, but I think it's exactly the intersectionality of our being, that we are many other things, and how I look tells you just one little bit of the story, but there's many other things that people don't recognize. And of course, perhaps later we can talk about, so how do we do this? How do we then build inclusivity in the process whilst we're working towards the future? But I'm really interested in Danielle, whether you have any other ideas. I can keep going on for the whole night again.
Yeah. There's so much in what you just shared, and there are a couple of things that stand out to me. So, the highly complex contextual nature of the conversation around equity and inclusion, right? So the context of South Africa is very different but related to the context of, racism and racial inequity in the US, and the way that even intersects with gender, the experience in Europe and the ways in which class and ethnicity plays out is highly, highly contextual. What I know about this work in the context of the States, which is where I've worked with, most of the places I've worked with, though we have a few global partners, is that we have really, really bad collective amnesia around our shared history, right? When I do trainings about, like kind of intro trainings around racism, I'll ask the question, like, how many of you were affected by redlining? And redlining was a policy in the US wherein if you were Black or a person of color, you could only get a mortgage in certain neighborhoods, whereas white folks could get mortgages everywhere. It had intergenerational implications on wealth building and the valuation of homes, and persists to this day, where neighborhoods that were redlined around race continue to be segregated around race in the same configuration as they were 70 years ago, and longer ago. And I'll ask the question, how many of you were affected by redlining? And only the Black people will raise their hands. And I'm like, actually, all of you were affected in some way by redlining if you live in the United States today, because the neighborhood that you live in now is a legacy of that. The wealth that your family was likely able to build as a result of access to resources and access to government support post-World War II affected you today, right? And so this legacy is not 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It permeates our communities to this day, and it impacts and influences who we hire in our organizations, who we're connected to socially, what our universities look like. Your social circle is very much shaped by the neighborhood that you grow up in. That's why I love urban planning so much, because places and the people in them shape even our organizations, right? And so that history is so critical to this work, being able to understanding in a deeply meaningful way how we arrived at the place that we're in really does help you start to think about different solutions to address and remediate those past harms, and then also look ahead to what solutions are important moving forward. And so I appreciate that callback around demographics of, let's like ground it in, these are apartheid categorizations, right? Similarly in the US, our categorizations on our census are old school, right? They are legacy. And then how do we look forward and look ahead? And I know Culture Amp does a lot around kind of gathering data and information. So I'm curious, Aubrey, if how you all have been able to grapple with this. And I imagine in the global context where in some countries you can't even ask questions around demographics. It's illegal to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. So like collecting data around DEI is like my happy place. So I could talk for hours at you about it. But I think this goes back to Gethi's really good point, and Danielle, also your point around how contextualization is important. Because I think so many of the Culture Amp clients come to us looking for like what's the right way, or what's the right ontology to collect data, and what's the right way to collect it. And I think, to go back to your point about a global perspective, is it's possible to build, I would say the racial data is the hardest thing to collect globally, because the concept of race or ethnicity is so variable across the globe. I think one example, right, would be even the way that the United States versus South Africa, for example, considers and categorizes mixed race people. So people who come from not just one, but multiple racial categories. And so I think what I would say is that it's an art as much as a science to collect diversity data. But what's even more important than whether you get a perfect ontology is the way that you collect that data, and almost, I would say, almost a sacredness with the care with you treat this data, because it is so sensitive and so private for folks. So what I always tell all of our customers and our clients is, first, be intentional about the data you're collecting, meaning that if you are collecting it, you must be willing to action or respond to it. So there's almost like a social contract that comes with people who give you that data voluntarily, right? Especially in most places, you can't compel people to provide it. But it's also really important as the data collector to be really clear with folks about, why are you collecting this data? How will it be stored and managed? Who will have access to individuated parts of that data? And then how will that data be used, represented, and shared? And all of that information needs to be provided to someone upfront, so they can make an informed, consensual decision about whether or not it is a useful risk or not for them to provide it. So that would be like, that wasn't exactly what you asked, but I think that as a framework is something that's useful to everyone, no matter what cultural context you're in. And then the second piece that I would say that's really important and not at all intuitive, I don't think, is unlike a technical service like Facebook, where like everyone is trying to express their individuality, right, on a Facebook page, when you're collecting data for an organizational context, you're not trying to create a list of categories so that everyone is perfectly self-expressed. So a really good example of this is like in LGBT data. So we know, for example, that there are dozens and dozens of genders that exist. But if you provided all of those options, you would create N sizes so small that you couldn't learn anything from the data, and so therefore couldn't actually improve those people's experiences. So it's more important to create categories that allow you to understand patterns and respond to them than it is to have that perfect definition. So if you're a small business, let's say you're an organization of 50 people. In the United States, I might actually suggest that until you grow a little bit, your racial categorizations are white and person of color. We agree that not all people of color have identical life experiences, clearly, but you're able to say, on average, white people versus people, racially minoritized people, are having a slightly different experience. And as your company grows and you have more humans, probably because you've raised the bar and hired more marginalized or underrepresented people, right? Then you can break out that ontology to be more specific, saying capturing Asian, Hispanic, Black, Pacific Islander, Native experience. So that's what I would say is be thoughtful about your data collection and then understand the purpose of that data is to give you organizational insight, not to allow individuals to self-actualize. That's a totally different process. But I'm really curious, so to circle back to Gethi, we've been talking about context, and I think so often we talk about private organizations, but I would be really curious on the educational side, what is the role that you see of universities in these sort of state and national sort of governmental organizations? What is their role in working with the private sector in us all kind of tackling this very gnarly challenge?
I think for me, I would say that our role should first focus on the young people who go through our hands, because those are the people who are going to end up in the private sector. So we start there, and I think we should start there in terms of supporting equality, diversity, and inclusion. And it's so in my view, what we should focus on is producing graduates who can self-critique, who can develop self-critique habits and recognition of our intersectionality. I think that's something that's missing in our society, the ability to self-critique, to criticize one's ideas, to recognize the intersectionality in our development of individuals. Even though we may look different, how we look is not all that we are, as I said earlier. We are many other things. And so if we practice self-critique, like I've been sitting here as you were speaking, Aubrey, and I'm saying, Aubrey told us that she's living with a disability. I think you said that at the beginning, right? And here we are.
Yes, it's sort of Culture Amp. We led with anti-racism as part of the strategy that I developed, but disability is sort of the next big piece that we're tackling.
Yeah. But I'm trying to self-critique, right? I didn't ask what kind of a disability are you living with. Okay, can you see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I just had a total insight. Thank you.
Yeah, we didn't ask. And for us at UCT, we reckon disability is a big area, right? But we don't only recognize physical disability, whatever, we recognize also mental disability. So there are students, for example, who have all sorts of mental health issues or mental disability or bipolar or whatever, who their therapists would recommend that they should be given extra 15 minutes per hour of the test or the exam. And they would have a separate room, but students living with disabilities have all, so we offer like a full house support for students living with disabilities. But the students, again, they have to self-declare. Whether it's a physical disability or a mental disability, they've got to self-declare. But what I'm saying about self-critique in terms of developing that in our students and in our people we graduate is that self-critique. It's very easy for me as a Black African woman to get all sensitive about, particularly that I grew up poor and everything, to get all sensitive about how I'm treated. But actually, I'm still privileged in many ways. Okay, if I compare myself with someone who's living with a disability, and whether they're on wheelchair or they cannot see or something like that. But if I focus only on myself and I don't self-critique, like now I'm saying, Aubrey should tell us what her disability is. Then it's like it's only my disadvantage that exists in the world, but there's other disadvantages or other ways that people are that contributes to their exclusion or marginalization in our society. And so that's something that I think we've got to develop in our graduates. But the second thing in that is that we never talk about much is allyship. Because I think if we develop a strong culture of allyship, we will find that there's much more of someone being aligned to some community in an area where they are not disadvantaged in, and they are an ally. But being an ally is not such an easy thing to do, because you're not really a member of that community. We want men who are allies to women. In my view, we need men who are aligned to the struggles of women. But they should never think that they are women. They are not women. So there's some humility about learning and listening and, understanding, so that you can be a much more impactful ally. But it's the same way with the LGBT community. It's the same way with all kinds of racial allyship and so on. So I think in terms of what we can do as universities, I think the world out there is so full of graduates, but many of them missed out on the opportunity to learn how to relate to people who don't look and think or think or even smell like them. Because even though universities are full of diversity, universities probably until recently, and probably some of them are still stuck in the past, haven't been very inclusive. Students come to study there, and the university wants them to assimilate to a particular culture. And again, it's a particular culture that is Western, that is white, that is male, a particular colonial from where I am. And that robs us as the world of the richness of the diversity. We get people graduating, all looking the same, thinking the same, doing the same, rather than recognizing the differences, recognizing the strengths that everyone brings, and working together, some being allies of some community that they didn't understand, and now they understand after spending time at university. So I think, that's my view in terms of university environments. And if you think about it, the cancel culture, I think grew up in universities. I mean, it thrives in universities because it's very easy to shut down the voices that you don't want to hear when you're in a group of young people. But it thrives because we haven't developed the discipline of self-critique and the inclination to be an ally, rather than to see those who are different from you as being in competition or whatever. Danielle, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, folks will ask me, like, what does leadership look like in the context of equity and inclusion? And you hit the nail on the head. Like, a leader who is introspective and who practices self-reflection, who understands where they're situated in the social context, where they're situated in their organizational ecosystem, a deep understanding of power, right? And how power plays out at the individual, interpersonal, organizational, and institutional and societal level, and really like practicing that muscle around introspection and around reflection, and knowing that you're not always going to get it right, and being able to own that and move forward, right? That's like so key to the successful movement of this work inside of our organizations. And it's one of the things that we definitely see a lot of leaders recognizing is more important now than the charisma or the ability to like get a lot of investors or whatever. It's, you know, we talked about it earlier, like it's one thing to get folks in your organization. It's another thing to be able to keep them, right? And that practice of introspection and empathy and emotional intelligence is so central to organizational success around this work. And that's not only for leaders, that's for individuals as well, right? That's for everyone from CEO all the way down to the mailroom to really be able to kind of practice that self-reflection and that introspection and using it to then change your behavior. It's one thing to say, man, I have a lot to learn, right? And it's another thing to actually learn that and then to do better. And you know, so really counterbalancing those good intentions with changed behavior is where the rubber really meets the road with this work, right? Something else you said around kind of allyship or people who aspire to be allies. And I always reframe it in my conversations with folks that you need to practice allyship. It's a verb. It's not an identity. You don't arrive at it. You know, I mentioned earlier, my mom is white, and her own kind of practice of allyship a few years ago had kind of atrophied, right? She got a little complacent around her analysis. And we had really hard moments in our relationship where I was raising the bar around her analysis and understanding of the world around us and how it was playing out and how she navigated that world or navigated our relationship. And while it was really painful, it allowed her to stretch and grow and challenge herself in new ways. And now she's able to kind of critique that behavior because she's practiced that reflection and that introspection, and she's able to change, you know, her behavior as a result. And so I see this playing out in organizational leadership as well. But it's an ongoing practice. It's one that's really kind of, you know, never ending. Aubrey, I don't know if anything in there resonates with you.
All of it. That was brilliant. No, I wanted to just tie like a couple of threads that you both touched on together, or like pull them out, because I don't know that I have anything particularly special to add to that. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is, Kati, you were talking about intersectionality and things like that. And I think that's a concept that's so important for us in allyship, because Danielle, I agree with you. Allyship is a verb. You have to do something. What I always say is I start talks and I'm like, how many people care about diversity? And people say with me, I'm like, I don't care. I do not care that you care about diversity because it doesn't count. What you do counts. But I think what's really important when we start to think about allyship is we have to be able to do this critical power analysis. So this goes back to the self-critique that people should be learning in universities, and also we need to take action. But the specific action that we should take as an ally, not that I'm anti the like, you know, BuzzFeed listicle of like 16 things you can do to be an ally today. Like if you're starting there, great, just do something. But I think that where we become really effective allies is where Danielle, as you said, is really learning to do that analysis and understanding where we are in the social context in any moment. And I will say for me, this has been a really specific journey because I mentioned before that I'm a white passing woman. And so for me, it's actually quite complex to figure out how do I show up as a racial ally, because I've both been minoritized, but also carry this incredible privilege because, you know, I need a lot of SPF. And so that's something where how I show up as an ally needs to change in every space that I'm in, right? If I'm in an all white space, maybe I'm not being asked to be an ally in the same way as I am when I'm in a predominantly sort of person of color room, or when I'm in a context where I'm disabled, right? I can still be an ally to the disabled community, even though I identify as that myself, because I carry a lot of privilege in that my disability, the answer is I'm bipolar, is invisible. And that confers privilege in a lot of ways because people don't know. And so that I just wanted to add that or pull those threads of what you said because they were really beautiful, which is the idea of these concepts work together really effectively. And I love that phrase, like allyship is a verb. I feel like we all need t-shirts.
Yeah. But Aubrey, you left your PhD program to move into the tech industry. What led to that? Was it part of your disability, or was there another reason?
It was sort of two things. And I imagine you've seen this in universities, but I don't think that it is unique to them, which was one, I saw the types of things. So I was in a program for Black, Hispanic, and Native students. And I frankly saw how we were all treated at the university. And I just didn't perceive that I could be successful. But the other side of the coin was, I just don't think I was particularly well suited to being a professor. I didn't know that. So I think part of it was I was so into research and data and research methods. And I found that being a professor without having the ability to like apply those things in a very real way, in a consistent way, just didn't line up with my interests or skill set. So one of the things I say about, I always call myself a perpetually recovering social scientist, because I feel really lucky to have been in an academic environment like that, because I think it gave me a true appreciation for the different way that academics can help us do this work. So I think very often, to go on a little tangent, but I want to ask you about this, so I'm cheating a little bit, and it speaks to sort of your a lot of things around, we can be, our culture around this work can be very shame, very blame, and very, there are people who have perspectives of the idea of like, there's one right way to do this work, or there's one right way to be an advocate for this work. And I think the more that I've learned, the more I've seen, academics do the kind of thinking that we need to understand the systems we're trying to change. Practitioners are doing a lot of that work of change. Activists or folks outside the organization are moving the Overton window so that those practitioners inside organizations can get more done. And so I would love to ask both of you, and maybe Khetsi, I'll start with you since I kind of bridged to university, but what do you see as the role of people in different specialties or different sort of focus and modalities working together? Where do you see the conflicts and where do you see kind of the bright moments?
And you mean disciplines? So you mean
disciplines? I just think this is such a complex problem, and it takes so many different skill sets and so many different actions and so many different ways of allyship, to pull back to Danielle's really great point. And I'd be curious for you, what do you see as some of the conflicts there, or the wins, or like what have you seen in your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for me in my position, because I work with people from all around the disciplines. And when you're in a meeting, how, for example, a philosophy professor would engage in a topic such as this one to a scientist, let me just say a physicist who wants the solution. And a philosophy or sociology professor would want to unpack it in one way or the other. And I find that a physics professor doesn't want to know about intersectionality and the complexity of this and that they would be interested in, so tell me how we solve this problem. Don't tell me how complex it is. How do we get to the solution? And I think that for me, the value of having these diverse people in one space is precisely that we see different things. We want different things from a conversation. And so it makes whatever we come out with a little more robust, because there's some questions that a sociology professor will not ask that a physics professor will ask, or a public health professor will ask. Even when we look at student scores, there are some professors, they're not racist, but they can see the achievement gap between Black and white students. It's just not something that's on their foreground. Whereas there will be some who it is, either because of lived experience or actually of their understanding of disadvantage from their discipline, even if they may not have the lived experience of people who've been marginalized. So that range of that diversity is actually key in in coming up with outcomes or solutions that are more robust and can move us forward. And I guess problems of today, that's why interdisciplinarity is so key today in universities, that because actually there isn't, I don't think there's any problem that affects society or any global problem that we can solve with just one discipline. And COVID has made that very clear. But in fact, all the other problems that we have made that very clear too, that you need perspectives from different people, and they would see the problem differently than other people. Some might even say there's no problem of race. It's a problem of schooling. Just get these kids taught better and they'll be fine here. And I would say, well, they have got all the scores. That's why we got them here. Now we've got to ask, why are we not managing to? Why are they not succeeding? And why is the gap? Why is it just Black students or working class students? Why is it like this? We've got to ask the question, and they might not see it as a serious question because of they think, well, it's just the schooling, but the different perspectives pushes us to look at, because we can say, well, maybe we are pretty skilled at teaching middle class and upper middle class students and not necessarily working class students. It's that self-critique again, looking at, are we prepared for the diversity of students that we admit, or are we only prepared for just one section because higher education is so middle class? And what does it mean to critique it? What does it mean to then want to do different in a way that you can serve students from working class and poor backgrounds? I hope I understood your question, Aubrey. Danielle, what do you think?
Yeah, and I'll be real quick because we only have a few seconds left. So to me, the perspectives, the various perspectives are absolutely critical in terms of what to do about it. I'm at the point where if we're not talking about reparations, and I mean in the US, and I also mean in colonized places around the world, we're not having the right conversation. And so to me, the bar now is, what does reparations look like in institutions, as an individual, as an organization? That's where I've landed with what we do about all these things. Yeah.
Wow, that's a tough place to be. It's a good place to be. I mean, it's another whole conversation. Thanks.
That feels like the most beautiful bridge to leave this on, which is both, there's been so much wisdom that you all have shared, and then it's like, what is the next conversation? Reparations.
Reparations, yes.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have enjoyed chatting with you guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. Let's stay in touch.
It's been a privilege to be here.